Good afternoon. So before presenting my theory, I need to explain what the state of brain research is. And I think that all of the neuroscientists in the audience, of which there are a few, know that there is no theory for how the brain works.
What do you mean by theory?
What do you mean by theory?
Okay, I will answer all these questions in 3 minutes. But just a few quotes from highly respected researchers. There are 100,000 articles each year, but they contain facts rather than insights. The overall logic of the brain remains a mystery. This is recent. This is from a book that came out just last year. Same authors forecast for 2064. Plenty of individual stories told, but they cannot be assembled into a coherent whole. And some people even think that we will never understand how the human brain works. So this is the state. I should say that the cellular level is relatively understood. Of course, that there are a lot of things to understand, but the overall function is relatively understood, and so is the behavioral level. What is missing is a mechanistic theory for the system level for the brain. Now, it's not a small feat to explain the brain. There are many things to understand, to explain. So we need to explain movements and language and sleep and perception and consciousness and emotions and all of the components of the brain and the different molecular agents that the brain uses, such as dopamine and serotonin. And there's a lot of experimental data also, experimental evidence that we need to explain. And I'm not going to to read all this, but the point was that a theory that claims to explain the brain must be able to explain all of these. It cannot just say, well, we explain the brain, but we cannot explain emotions. It's part of what the brain does. So my personal methodology for doing this was to start a project for how language is implemented in the brain. And that was 9 years ago, almost. And quite rapidly it progressed to a project for how the brain generally works, not just language, but everything. And the initial years were devoted to gathering facts. So I examined basically all of the available literature, at least from the last 20 years, with many citations in Google Scholar and all that. And I tried to arrange the facts in a way that at least would satisfy my understanding of what a theory is. And the first paper was completed at the end of 2017, and since then I wrote 2 or 3 additional papers. So right at the start I will talk about the type of theory that I present, what it means, in my opinion, to explain the brain, where there is one main idea, which is a single process, really a simple process, with 2 instances can explain everything. The 2 instances of the process are execution and need. So the execution process is a rapid process that deals with movements and language and imagination and thought, everything that's being executed. And the need process can be slower, can take hours, and involves the major molecular agents. So as time permits, I will describe, I will at least sketch many of these topics. Let's start by just stating what the function of the brain is. So the brain manages the interaction between the organism and the external environment to satisfy internal needs and to address external threats. It's external threats because internal threats are addressed by the immune system, not by the brain. The brain does this function by producing movements, mostly of skeletal muscles, but also of smooth muscles. And this is done in response to sensory inputs. So we have three types of inputs. External inputs, visual, auditory, touch, smell, and taste. Proprioceptive inputs, which convey the state of muscle contraction, the tendons, and things that relate to movement. And interoceptive inputs that convey the state of the body, all body tissues basically, including the gut and the heart and the teeth and everything. So many people are not aware of this, but when I say sensory inputs, please don't think only of external inputs. Sensory inputs are also internal, and they convey what the organism needs. So it's basically a sensory response system. Now, in terms of architecture, it's a complex system. It's an adaptive complex system. So we have a large number of interconnected parts, neurons. There are, of course, also glial cells, but I will not discuss them because they're related to plasticity and energy. There are excitatory and inhibitory connections, which will be important at some point in the presentation. Behavior and all of the brain function is not managed by anything. It emerges from the interaction between the small interconnected pieces. So it's a complex system. We have innate capacities, which are species dependent and define their repertoire of what the organism can sense and do. So we have sensors that are unique to each species and responses that are unique to each species. And there are low-level responses, such as the ones that induce muscle contractions, and also higher-level innate responses, which implement the well-known circuits for fight, freeze, flight, consume, and the basic well-known responses. Now, the fact that it's an adaptive system means that it learns from past experience, and all of these words are basically synonyms, or almost synonyms. So adaptivity and development, learning, plasticity, performance, automaticity, memory, all these terms refer to the same phenomenon. The basic principle is that successful responses are strengthened, and successful means that these are the responses that are executed. So everything that's executed is strengthened. So what kind of a theory is the theory that I'm presenting? It's a theory that's based on a process. It does not describe the brain using equations, for example, as is good for physics, but as a process, as I think is the best way for biological systems. The process has two instances, as I said earlier. There is the need process that defines what needs to be done in order to satisfy needs, in order to fulfill the brain's function. And there is the Quacks process. I will define this word, Quacks, in a minute, which says, or which manages how to obtain these needs. Now, a major aspect of the theory is that it explains these processes in terms of the components of the brain. So it explains the system by detailing its components and how they interact, which again is, I think, what should be done to explain a brain theory. So the different stages of the Q process use specific neural networks. I will explain them in detail. And the different stages of the need process use specific molecular agents. Okay, so this is like explaining a car. So we can explain what a car does by just indicating the equations of energy usage and motion, but this is not satisfying because we will not understand how it does that. But in order to explain a car, we can say, so there's an engine, there's a radiator, they interact in this way. So this is the way to explain biological systems. And I should say that after completing the theory, I discovered that it's almost the same process and the same kind of theory as the accepted standard scientific explanation of the immune system and of evolution and even of genetics. And I think that was very good to discover. An additional aspect of a theory that we want is that it should be simple. So it is quite simple, and I will hide all the complicated details in this talk.
Saying new things.
Excuse me?
The theory should say something new.
Yes, of course. So I have this, some of the slides will have a little theory contribution sign down there in order to indicate what's new. But this is also new. This is the process. It's very simple. It's the response process. Again, the process that's shared for the brain and the immune system and evolution. So we have sensory inputs because, as we said, it's a sensory response system. If there is an innate response, then the sensory input triggers it by hardwired connections. If there is a learned response, an adaptive response, then the adaptive response is executed. And if there isn't, the interesting part is that there is an acute response. The acute response has 3 basic stages, or 5 depending how you look at it. First, there is an alert, a global widespread alert that tells the brain that something unknown has happened and things should be done. Then there are candidate responses that are activated following the alert. And these candidate responses are basically all of the responses that responded in the past to features of the current input. So all of the possibly relevant responses are activated. And there is, if the situation is urgent, then there is a coarse response, which means it is several candidates are executed at the same time. So it's not fine response, it's a vigorous response. And if the situation is not that urgent, then there is a process of competition that suppresses some of the candidates, selects a winning response, a focused response, and executes it. And this acute response, which is selected, is then learned to become an adaptive response. This is the basic process. Yes. I will answer questions.
How do you choose whether you go in that direction or both?
Okay, so this is hard-coded. So there are sensory inputs are species-dependent hard-coded, and if they trigger an innate response, then they do so due to wiring or the identity of the molecules that are conveyed there.
So this is a possibility. It's either that or both.
Yes, it's either that or both. If, for example, a learned response is possible, but it's not completely automated, then we will also go in that direction. So the flow only stops due to competition. It doesn't stop because of the stages of this process. But I will explain this a little bit more. Now, just again to say what kind of a theory this is, because all of the first half of the talk will I think, be very simple, and you will wonder, okay, so what's new here? So, in evolution, the candidates in the acute response are called variation, and the stage of competition is called survival of the fittest. So it's exactly this same diagram could describe evolution. And in immunity, the acute response is called inflammation.
So you mean exactly the same diagram, including the lower part of the diagram?
I think so, yes. But I haven't gotten to prove it completely, not at the level of genetics. But even the DNA behaves like that. I have partial indications evidence to indicate that it's true. So immunity has an acute response which is called inflammation, and it has adaptive immune cells that manage acute responses, and immune responses, even if they are adaptive, are implemented in terms of using innate cells. So it's like this connection over here. And then there's learning, which is what enables vaccination. So this type of theory, which you were quick to ask me about, is the type of theory that's accepted in biological systems. Now, I'm also willing to state this, that all adaptive complex systems would employ this process. But of course, this is a little bit hard to prove. It includes the future. So the first part will be the Quacks process, the execution of action sequences. So some basic anatomy. We have, I know that many of you are not familiar with the brain at all. So here's the spinal cord, the brain stem. At the center of the brain there's the thalamus and the basal ganglia near it, the neocortex, the cerebellum, and a few well-known, or at least in the popular culture, structures such as the hippocampus, amygdala, and hypothalamus. Sensory inputs arrive bottom up, so touch inputs and others, and interoceptive inputs arrive via the spinal cord, and the other sensory inputs arrive generally in a posterior to anterior manner. So visual input arrives here, and touch input reaches here. So we have flow that reaches from bottom to top, and then it reaches anterior regions. This is the general flow. And I will focus on cortex, but please don't think that the theory is corticocentric and that I ignore innate circuits. Innate circuits would employ exactly the same principles, but it's easier to explain it on cortex. So cortex is layered. There are between 6 to 7 layers. That depends on how you count, and in some regions there are fewer layers. Each layer has different cell types and different characteristics. And the neurons in the cortex are arranged in structures called the microcolumns, which I call nodes for simplicity, that are collections of neurons that probably activate together. Okay. Now, so the basic computational object that the brain computes is what I call the Quacks. Now, I had to invent a word because a word did not exist for this. But I think that the concept that there is a sparse distributed set of neurons that implement the brain's response, this concept is known. People know that very few neurons, relatively speaking, participate in each response. But there was no term, so I invented the Quacks, plural quasha. So these are the neurons that are actively participating in the sensor response mapping. This is what we want to compute. So we want to compute a Quacks that connects sensory neurons, the neurons that receive sensory inputs, action neurons, those implementing movement and other actions, valence neurons that directly motivate, according to needs, the computation, and events. So when I talk about the Q process, the Quacks process, it is how quasha are formed and how they are updated. Now, what we see here is, it's a view of cortex from above. Circles are nodes, the microcolumns that I described earlier. And we have sensory neurons here and action neurons here, or action nodes here, valence nodes here. And the yellow ones are those suppressed by competition. Now, before proceeding, I have to just close one little formal item here. I said that we have sensory neurons, sensory nodes, action nodes, valence nodes. But this is intuitive. It's people usually look at fMRI pictures and they say, "Oh, this area contains a sensory." It's a visual area because it lights up when we process visual input. So this is not a well-defined definition, and this is the computer science colloquium. So I need to define it. So a neuron represents an entity X if and only if it activates when the brain processes X. So this is very simple. Two following points are not that simple, and many people forget them. The first point is that a neuron can represent many entities. So if we have a neuron that lights up whenever we process faces, it represents all of the faces that we can see, or almost all of them. So
when you say activates, there's no time delay, there's instantaneous? What do you mean?
Excellent question, and I will ignore it if you will permit me, but it's a really good question.
Otherwise it's not defined.
Okay, so I can define it, but it will take me too much time. But it's a really good point, because you can ask yourself, what kind of delay am I permitting to make it? It's a few hundred milliseconds, basically, but I have to spend a lot of time to justify it. Now, the second point about representations is that an entity can be represented by many neurons. So it's not necessarily the case that whenever we see one face, there is just one neuron that always lights up. Maybe there are, first of all of the neurons inside the node probably represent the same thing. So the node, in my opinion, is the basic representational unit. And second, because responses are paths, a Quacks contains many neurons, then whenever we process a specific face even, maybe this involves a large number of neurons. So using this definition, we can define object or sensory object areas. So these would be the primary sensory cortices and the association cortices. We can define action areas, which would be the motor areas in the middle here and prefrontal areas right here. So they are anterior. There are valence areas, and valence is based on needs, so on innate responses and on interoceptive inputs. And we have the amygdala over here, hiding there, the insula hiding here. I will talk about it more in the second part of the talk. And then we have events, which are combinations of objects, places, action, valence, represented mostly at the hippocampus. So now we have the basic computational unit, the Quacks, well defined, and we can proceed to one of the major contributions or tenets of the theory, and that we can assign functions according to the basic process to the cortical layers. Now we can do this also for innate circuits, as I said before, but I will ignore it because they are more complicated than Cortex. So the bottom most relevant layer is layer 5B. There is also a layer 6 which serves for synchrony. I will ignore it. So the bottommost layer is the response network, and it has neurons that project out of cortex to motor centers and to autonomic nervous system centers, and all of everything that goes out of the brain is innervated by the response network. Then at layer 4 we have the sensory network. So this is where the thalamus brings sensory inputs. Above it we have the alert network. Above it we have the decision-making network, where the candidates would be. And layer 5A would be the goal or prediction network, and I will explain these terms in a minute. Now, I don't have time to get into this, but I'm just mentioning that the networks are extended to other structures as well, not just innate circuits or the cortex, but also at the hippocampus and cerebellum here, and the dorsal cochlear nucleus, which is a cerebellum-like structure. So we can assign the components of these structures, and we can assign networks to them as well. Now, to explain how networks and the process and the Q process together can explain motor control, we need to ask ourselves what it is that we really want to understand. So what guides the basic movements? How are hierarchical action sequences implemented? So we have both sequences and hierarchy here. How does the brain know when to stop moving? There must be a signal that says stop. Now there are many theories, of course, for motor control, forward models where the inputs are muscle commands and the outputs are desired limb configurations. There are inverse models, there is optimization and control theory. And all of them, I think, assume that there is an explicit representation to action plans. So what I will describe is something that does not assume anything of this sort, and that explains how movement emerges without being managed and without being explicitly represented. So we have here a small illustration of the process just to remind us. If you recall, we had in the Quacks, we had action neurons and we had sensory neurons. So the action neurons in the Quacks specify sensory goals of the movement, and they excite all of the neurons that were involved in attaining such goals in the past. So anything that was relevant for our current goal is excited. These are the response candidates, this rectangle in the process. How is the concrete, the specific action that's executed selected? So it is selected by sensory inputs. Sensory inputs trigger and select the action to execute. And they also, this includes the next action to execute when we talk about sequences. So this is the competition rectangle here, which is resolved by sensory input. And this automatically, as I will show in a minute, implements hierarchical sequences as well. So there is no explicit representation of action plans, of the order of execution. There is no optimization. There's nothing, not even a neuron is in, a single neuron is in control here. All neurons just specify their candidates, and sensory input resolves that the external reality resolves what it is that we're going to execute at any given moment.
So these are systems without memory. I mean, everything is done by sensory input, I believe.
Yes, but it is an adaptive complex system, so it remembers previously executed quasha. So there are connections that are stronger.
The previous sensory inputs are also inputs?
No, they are the result of plasticity. So I assume for convenience that I can detach execution and the current state and the state of the system just prior to execution. Now you can say, and you would be right, that there is short-term memory, which...
Not only short-term, we have some long-term memory also.
Yes, long-term memory is what I was referring to when I said plasticity. So there is also short-term memory, and I will explain how it works. Now, so a motor Quacks contains a response neurons that implement the commands to motor centers, to muscle contractions, and goal neurons that implement, that represent the sensory object goals of the action. So these are two nodes. It's an action node and a sensory object node, the two typical nodes in movement execution. But as long as the action is executed, the sensory node is not active in response mode. It is only active in goal mode. Now when the goal has been attained, then by definition the nodes that represent this goal, this sensory configuration that serves as our goal, holds in reality. So if it holds in reality, then its sensory network activates, and the combined inputs from the sensory network down here and the goal activate it in response mode. So when something that we want to happens, it is activated in response mode. We perceive it as part of reality, and the fact that it happened triggers the next action in the sequence, as in the following illustration. So what we have here is that the activation of the sensory node in response mode innervates or excites or flows to the action areas where it meets the candidates that are excited by the action, by the currently executing action. And then it selects the best action there, and where best is a combination of what's best according to both sensory inputs and the candidates triggered by the currently executing action. And at the same time, the response network of the action innervates and excites all of the candidates for sensory perception. Okay, so Now, there are also internal cortical connections between the networks. So there is flow. The alert network, for example, flows from an alert in a bottom-up manner to the sensory network of the next higher level areas and so forth. And the decision-making network and the goal network flow in the opposite direction, in the top-down direction. Now, this part is complicated by the presence of the basal ganglia and the thalamus, which are needed in order to sustain the operation and to make it more stable and to make all of this neural firing synchronous. But this is too technical and I don't have time to discuss it, so I won't. Maybe towards the end, if I have time to describe what happens in Parkinson's disease. Now, just to explain, using an example, how this gives us hierarchical sequences for free, since I said that their action order and hierarchy are not represented explicitly. So let's take as an example, we have sensory input that indicates hunger. Again, this is sensory input from the gut, from the heart, from many internal organs that sense a lack of energy and that the gut is empty. Now these sensory inputs activate reach hunger representing neurons in interoceptive areas, and they innervate hunger satisfying representations, which means that all of the neurons that participated in satisfying hunger in the past are now excited to some degree, all of them. Now suppose we have visual inputs indicating an apple or something that can satisfy hunger. Then as sensory input, this triggers an action plan to reach the apple, and these are at least 3 different movements. So it's reach, grasp, reach back, and chew. So 4 different movements. This is an action plan because it involves many muscles, and they are suppressed and replaced and all that. So what enables the action what enables movement are proprioceptive inputs from the muscles and the tendons. As long people who don't have these cannot move unless they train themselves to move based on visual inputs, for example. Okay, so this is an example, and it's all the same principle. So the higher level need neurons or motivating neurons, they also don't tell us what to do. They just excite everything that was relevant in the past. And the reality, the sensory environment, is what determines what it is that we are going to do and how we are going to do it. Now, an essential component in this architecture...
Can you say again, how does it determine?
Which one?
You said that according to the sensory inputs, you determine which of the possibilities are chosen.
So sensory input here... Okay, sensory input arrives and it flows in a bottom-up manner, and it meets the flow that's generated by it, meets action areas at some point. Now some of these action neurons are already excited because they are excited by the higher level motivation nodes. At some point the combined flow, bottom-up and top-down flow, is enough to activate the response network. Okay. Now, an essential component here is competition, because we have candidates and we have competition, and it has to be resolved somehow. And this is done by inhibitory neurons. So inhibitor agents, the main ones being GABA and glycine, reduce a neuron's positive charge. So they reduce the probability of neural firing. And we have interneurons, which are local inhibitory neurons, that receive coordination requests from excitatory neurons around them. This is my term, it's not standard. Almost nothing in this slide is standard, if you think about it. Now, inhibitory neurons do not implement inhibition. a lot of papers say that, okay, so we have inhibition, we have psychological inhibition, so this is implemented by GABA neurons. This is wrong. Inhibitory neurons implement a winner-takes-all mechanism. They amplify signal to noise. If we look at this example here, suppose we have an INN, an inhibitory interneuron, and it innervates another neuron, and it fires just before the other neuron fires. In this case, it really inhibits it. This is the yellow part here. But if the inhibitory neuron excites other neurons and it fires right after they have fired, it doesn't inhibit them. It resets the state of their charge, the accumulation of their charge, so it synchronizes them. This means that they are now going to fire at the same time, which makes their firing stronger. So this is a signal-to-noise mechanism. This is why I'm not calling this just competition, but that the role of so-called inhibitory interneurons is coordination. It's both competition, which involves suppression, and sustained synchronized firing at the end. Now there are at least 4, maybe 5 different coordination networks with at least 14 types of different inhibitory neurons. So I'm not getting into this. We don't have the time to do that. I will skip that. It's too technical. Just to say one word about learning. So the quasha that are selected to execute using this algorithm are learned. This is, the standard Hebbian learning principle, whereby the internal synapses are strengthened and the boundary synapses are weakened, and these are exactly the synapses that participated in competitions and were suppressed and lost the competition. So the signal-to-noise mechanism also defines what we are going to learn and what we are going to not to unlearn or to forget. But this is not a good word for this. Now, the main agents that induce intracellular learning processes, including genomic processes, are calcium and zinc. And everything depends also on the agents of the need process, which I'll talk about in a minute. Now, when automaticity happens, when learning happens, the elegant description of how sensory input flows in the different networks and so forth, all this gets blurred because things can happen in parallel. So it's not going to be in automated areas such as primary sensory cortices. It's not going to be so elegant as I described. Now there's really a lot of evidence to support this account. The anatomy, which I described the anatomy, the networks and the connectivity between the networks. EEG, so we have negative and positive event-related components. The N170, which is supposed to be a negative component in the EEG when we perceive faces. Negative components indicate competition, and positive components indicate competition resolution. Or you can say that negative components indicate the candidate wave, and then the positive components indicate the competition resolution. Then we have oscillations, which support this account. Imaging data, single neuronal recording, and different phenomena called, for example, repetition suppression, efference copy. These are well known for dozens of years, but the accounts given to them so far, the standard accounts are different from the one that I described. Now, important evidence is also given by the agents of the need process, and I will get to it. So I explained the cue process using movement, but what I'm saying is that all brain capacities use the same process. So language is the same process, imagination, thinking, even dreaming, although it's a little more different than others, feelings and emotions. If We take language, for example. So in the beginning of the talk, I said that the role of the brain is to generate movements. So usually it generates movements done by the organism. Language, or in communication in general, is a capacity that allows one brain to generate movements made by other organisms. Now, to do that, it has to bridge the neuronal gap between the organism's brain and the brain of the other organism generating the movement. This is the only difference between language and self-movement. Everything else, it behaves exactly the same. So, just to illustrate this, language has representations that have objects, basically words, and the words are adjacent to the areas that represent visual objects. We have actions, and we have speaking actions here, motor actions, and comprehension and language generation actions, which are in linguistics called syntax. And we have hierarchical sequences that emerge just as all other capacities. And there is also a new type, or an extended type of object, which is all the knowledge that we acquire through language, which is generated in the anterior part of the brain, in the anterior lateral part of the brain. Now, if we finished with language, that's it. But really, it's the same. All of the data point to the fact that language behaves, and all of the evidence behaves just like motor control. Now, imagination, which includes static and dynamic visual objects, inner speech, thinking, music, that we can play in our heads, all of these are, I think that they have evolved for the planning and mode, and so I will talk about it in a minute. But in terms of their implementation, it's just a normal queue process with high-level object nodes, but without the low-level sensory nodes. So when we imagine, we don't perceive our imagination as occurring in reality unless we are hallucinating, which is possible. But we are aware of which objects are activated because they are higher level objects. And there is no reason why we could not be aware of higher level objects. Now you can ask, if there are no low-level sensory nodes, what triggers the transitions? Because I emphasize that everything is dictated by the external reality. So in this case, transitions are triggered by nodes that are activated in response node without sensory input. And this requires that the frontal flow that specifies goals will be strong enough. So it can use a triangulation mechanism in order to activate these higher level object nodes without sensory inputs. And there are also indications that this strong frontal flow is possible maybe only for primates, but I'm not sure it's conclusive, this kind of evidence. Now we can ask, why not touch? It's not possible to imagine touch in the same way that we imagine faces, right? So a possible answer here is that touch does not have the cortical space for higher level object nodes. They just don't exist because it's very fast. The brain has nothing to activate in order to imagine. There is another more difficult question, which is how does the brain know when it is imagining and when it sees something or it senses something in the external reality? So I think I will be able to answer this. So far I described the queue process, the fast process that implements the brain execution, which computes a Quacks. Now the second instance of the main process is the need process. It's an instance of the same process. So it has candidates, it has competition, it has an alert, sensory inputs, innate responses, but it has a slower time course, or it has a potentially slower time course, because satisfaction of needs can take years. if the need is to obtain a university degree, right? But it can also take minutes, hours, if the need is to find food. So it's exactly the same process. Here, the different stages of the process are not mapped to networks as I described earlier. They are mapped to brain areas, which I will not show, but more interesting is the fact that they are mapped to auxiliary molecular agents. So almost every stage of the process is aided by an agent. Goals are set by dopamine, and planning is set by serotonin, and execution is supported by ACH, and all of the innate responses are supported by oxytocin and by the opioids. Now, this need process also includes energy management and plasticity management, which are supported by steroids, and I will not get into this. It's more complicated, and it includes other bodily systems. So the general principles with the agents is that most of them act through several receptors. And when I say they act, I mean that these receptors are located on the R networks that are currently implementing the execution stage that the agent wants to promote. So it promotes its own mode, and it suppresses competing agents and competing modes. So serotonin, which as I said is responsible for slow planning, suppresses, generally speaking, and dopamine, which is responsible for rapid course responses. This is not completely correct because dopamine also has motivational aspects which serotonin does not suppress, but this is the general picture. All of these agents induce learning via genomic processes, and many of them, at least the main ones, dopamine, and adrenaline, serotonin, and ACH, they innervate very wide brain areas. So I think I don't have enough time to discuss everything that I wanted, so I will skip dopamine except saying that its public image is too good, because the public image says that it's supposed to be to promote reward or joy, while this is not exactly what it does. It promotes coarse responses, engage responses whereby you engage an object using strong and vigorous movements. In experiments, this is usually associated with reward because most of the dopamine experiments involve monkeys or other animals that suddenly see a piece of food. But people know, at least for 10 years now, that dopamine is also activated in aversive situations when we have a negative surprise. But the feeling of vigor and motivation is what I am told is induced by cocaine and amphetamines. Now, if we focus a bit on serotonin, so it is triggered as an N-mode competition agent, non-urgent. It suppresses innate responses, which includes emotions. It slows down movements. It excites the decision-making network. And this means that it excites many response candidates. So we have many different candidates that are excited, which explains, if we go here, why microdoses of LSD are supposed to enhance creativity. I never tried, but I believe this could be true because this serotonin agent simply excites all of the response candidates, so it allows more possible responses. Now, its public image is also incorrect. People are associated with happiness, probably because selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors are used to counter depression. But again, it's not a good description. It induces motivated calm and patience, which may be good against depression, but it doesn't induce happiness. It suppresses emotions, for example. It also suppresses a sexual urge. And there is a problem whereby the interaction between serotonin and dopamine means that initially these drugs can suppress serotonin paradoxically because they can act on autoreceptors on serotonin neurons that suppress its activity and thereby enhancing dopamine. So there is a risk of suicide, for example, in using these drugs. Just to complete the picture, in schizophrenia, the best or the first line of defense today, of treatment today, are atypical antipsychotics, which are serotonin antagonists. So people with schizophrenia suffer from hallucinations, so if we tune down their serotonin, then it can reduce the activation of the decision-making network and reduce the candidates. ACH is the agent that supports execution. So this is what sustains execution, focused execution, the response network. It also is the agent that directly innervates the muscles, or most muscles. It is very fast, it is focused both spatially and temporally, and it is highly associated with attention. So smoking I believe that smoking can indeed enhance attention until it produces its own damages. Now, ACH is the agent that degenerates in all types of dementia, including Alzheimer's and primary progressive aphasia and all of the dementia, almost all of the dementia subtypes. Now, this is not surprising because what we have, for example, with Alzheimer's, is a difficulty in recording reality and accessing neurons in reality mode, which is called memory. So if ACH degenerates, then reality, or the reality stored in our brains, is no longer accessible to us. I will skip opioids and oxytocin, except again say that they are the agents that promote innate responses. And because I want to discuss feelings and emotions, which are possibly, and consciousness, which are possibly the toughest things to explain. So
you have 10 minutes for consciousness.
I will finish the hard problem of consciousness in 30 seconds, in a minute. So feelings, the feelings include pain and awareness of sensing something and feeling of knowing. This is a nice type of feeling. Consciousness, as you can define as a feeling of existing, of being alive. We have emotions, which are not the same thing as feeling. Emotion is a type of feeling. The important thing to say here is that these are all subjective phenomena. But so the only way that science can investigate them is through reportability. So there are paradigms, there are experimental paradigms that examine all of these phenomena by seeing if the organism can report whatever it feels or whatever it perceives. An important comment is that it is possible that these phenomena are not only accessible to science via reportability, maybe they are reportabilities. That is, they are reports. And this is what I believe. So just as an anecdotal example, athletes and soldiers who get injured do not usually notice that they are injured if they are engaged in attentive action. So it doesn't mean, it means that the brain can just suppress the neurons that represent the feeling of pain, just as it represents everything else. This is anecdotal, yeah, I am aware of this. So in this theory, feelings, and in other theories, there are people who have proposed this account already, feelings are reports of interoceptive states. So it's an ordinary quacks with the interoceptive nodes, the nodes that represent inputs from the gut and the heart and the internal body tissue, at the insula, which is right here at the center of the brain. These nodes are the goals of the feeling. So if you are asked, what do you feel pain now? This translates to a Quacks that has a goal. One of the goals of this Quacks, the goal nodes, are the nodes, the insular nodes that represent pain. And if these nodes are activated in reality mode, which means if there is truly painful input, then you would report yes. Otherwise, you would report no. These are feelings. Now, emotions are almost the same things. They are reports of N modes, of need modes. So these are the modes of the need process that I just described. And they are also accessible via the insula. So, for example, the emotion called depression reports the N mode, which I called failure, one of the innate responses of the brain, which are promoted by opioids. In this case, the opioid is dynorphin. Now, there are very interesting and horrible disorders whereby some of these nodes are impaired, and then people cannot feel or cannot report emotions. Maybe most interesting is Cotard's disorder, in which the insula is impaired, and people say that they are not alive. They simply feel that they are not alive, which makes you think possibly the feeling of being alive is simply by the fact that your heart conveys inputs to your brain. So this is consciousness. Reality is just the ACH execution mode. And I promised Dorit the hard problem of consciousness, which is qualia. Why do we sense redness and blueness and whatever and everything else as different? Right? So this is supposed to be hard because we have a certain wavelength and another wavelength, and why would we report them as different? And it's really easy because all of the object nodes on which consciousness is based represent different things. So every neuron, in principle, can represent a different sensory configuration. And these are the things that we can explain. But if you didn't understand the last 30 seconds, it's okay, because this is a well-known problem in philosophy, and I just answered it. Okay, dreaming. Dreaming is a cue process. We have neurons that represent reality that are activated during sleep. If I had 5 more minutes, I could explain the processes that take place and activate these neurons. But in general, what happens is that during rapid eye movement sleep and a little bit before that, the neurons that were active during the day, they have accumulated calcium and zinc, and they are excited. And after the previous sleep stages clean the brain, these neurons can start firing. So and these are our dreams. So dreams are made from the content of reality occurring during wake, but it's not the same scenario. We don't dream exactly what happened to us because the order of activation of these neurons is arbitrary. So to sum up, this is a scientific theory about the brain, a mechanistic theory. It's comprehensive. I think I try to address all of the known behavioral phenomena. It's refutable because it's really highly mechanistic. It allows a wealth of theory predictions. I described the process with agents, roles for neural networks, order of execution between them. So it's really, most of the things that I described cannot be measured by current technology because they are much more precise. Excuse me?
One non-trivial prediction?
Everything would be trivial. I mean,
Right, something that we can test and see if it's right or wrong.
Yes, if you take an untrained brain area and you see that its response network knows how to answer before the decision-making network is activated, then you have refuted this theory. Because what I'm saying is that the decision-making network, L23, must activate candidates in order to train the response network. But that, I could phrase 100 like that.
Because I didn't define what are the networks. So obviously
I did.
No, you didn't give me any specific measurement.
Excuse me, that there are layers. This is well known. The fact that cortex is divided into layers that have different properties.
But you didn't say which one is prediction, which one is decision, which one is a... No, never mind.
I did.
Yeah, no,
Sorry.
No, it's not in an anatomical description. This is a block diagram.
This is anatomical.
Ari, let me ask a question.
Well, wait a minute. This is an important point. This is one of the major contributions of the theory. The fact that we have layers and we know that layers exist, but nobody, as far as I know, defined functional correlates of the layers.
Is always goal.
It is always goal, except that after training, things start getting diffused because they would be activated in parallel. This is why I said that to refute it, you need to take an untrained piece of cortex.
Okay.
Okay. What else do I have to say? Of course, it's quite simple, but I did hide the complex details. It's biological, and it is really supported by a lot of evidence, but by all of the evidence I am aware of. I didn't find anything that contradicts it, but of course you could say that I designed the theory so that it would not contradict anything. But really, the fact that after devising the theory, I found out that it looks almost the same, like the accepted theory of the immune system, and of course in retrospect of evolution, I think is a strong point in favor of this theory. Now, since we are computer scientists, or at least many of us, some comparison with the current deep networks is possible. So the deep networks learn to minimize error, but the brain learns what it executes, so it's closer to reinforcement learning, which exists, of course. Deep networks don't have competition because all neurons convey excitatory flow, but competition with inhibitory neurons is fundamental to the theory. Deep networks are two-dimensional, while the cortex that I described is three-dimensional because it has layers. Deep network neurons, all of them carry content, while in the need process there is a very important role for agent neurons and auxiliary structures and structures with special architecture. And of course, deep networks currently only learn simple associations, while this kind of architecture can learn to be flexibly intelligent.
We're out of time.
Yes, so I did not present my account of disorders because I knew that I would go out of time, but the theory does include all of these disorders. And in the future there are many interesting issues, including the computer simulation of the theory, and I'm willing to bet that we will pass the Turing test in much less than 20 years, because I know that this is how the brain works, and we will be able to simulate simple brains like that in a few years. And they will show intelligence, flexible intelligence. That's it.
One question.
So, how DBS fits in the theory?
What is it?
What?
Deep,
How DBS?
deep brain stimulation. So this is DBS is a technique mostly used today to treat Parkinson's disease, which involves depletion of dopamine, damage to ACH neurons and to many other neurons, tremor, slow movement, rigidity, and all that. And my account says that in the basal ganglia, people know that there are two paths. People think that the standard account is that one of them supports moving and the other one supports stopping. But my theory implies that the paths support acute responses versus learned execution. What goes wrong with Parkinson's is that the indirect path, which is what supports learned execution, is too excitable. It's not controlled, which means that the things that innervate your execution or your muscles get into an synchronous oscillation mode very easily, and this is why tremor is produced in Parkinson's, because they move in a synchronous mode. What DBS does is impair this path. It excites this path using very high frequency fire neural flow. So it neutralizes this path because it's high frequency, and this path is supposed to be active in low frequency mode, and thereby it disconnects the basal ganglia from the rest of the brain, so the brain can kind of execute. But the basal ganglia are essential for learning new things, so people with Parkinson's are indeed impaired in learning new things. So this is now.
Yeah, I'm sure we will have enough questions. We're really out of time, so let's thank you.